Welcome back to another explainer in the Mike is Outside Research Review series. If you absolutely love the outdoors but sometimes feel a little disconnected from the dense academic science that actually dictates how our wild spaces are managed, well, you're in the right place today. We are taking a pretty heavy, multi-layered piece of academic research and translating it into a highly practical field guide for you. We're going to really dig into the messy realities of sustainable tourism, local livelihoods, and the protected areas that we all love to explore. Okay, let's take a super quick look at our roadmap for today. First, the Mike is Outside review. 2, the Conservation Development Nexus. 3, realities on the ground. 4, who holds the power. 5, practical rules for impact. And finally, 6, the final verdict. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, the Mike is Outside review.
So, we're focusing our lens today on a recent book review published in the World Leisure Journal, written by Brian Ki-Moon Wong and Mungling Voon. They took on the task of reviewing a massive, frankly intimidating text called Protected Area Sustainable Tourism and Community Livelihood Linkages. Now, what is actually fascinating about this specific review is how it completely slices through all that standard academic jargon. It exposes the highly complex and honestly the really messy reality of how tourism and local livelihoods actually collide out in the wild. It totally skips the rosy, idealized theories of conservation, and instead it gets right down to the friction, the real boots-on-the-ground reality of what happens when basic human survival meets environmental protection.
Moving on to Section 2. The Conservation Development Nexus. Let's start by looking at how our whole approach to protected areas has completely shifted over the last few decades. Think about the old model, those strict conservation spaces. This was your classic look but definitely do not touch mentality, right? Spaces managed purely to protect biodiversity, but very often at the direct expense of the indigenous people and locals who actually lived there. Now contrast that with the new model, where we treat these areas as multifunctional landscapes. Today, we expect protected areas to literally do it all. They have to protect biodiversity, drive local tourism development, and somehow support community livelihoods all at once. It's an absolutely massive balancing act. It's kind of like expecting a single park ranger to be a wildlife ecologist, a macroeconomist, and a UN diplomat all at the exact same time. So the absolute crux of this whole thing is captured perfectly in this quote from the text. Ecotourism is not a panacea. It's not some magical silver bullet. It is a highly contingent, incredibly context-dependent tool. I mean, just because you slap an ecotourism destination label on a map doesn't mean it's actually going to benefit the environment or the local people. It literally only works if the specific localized setup is intentionally built to succeed. Which brings us to Section 3. Realities on the ground.
To prove that tourism really isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, the book takes us on this fascinating global tour across 11 totally distinct case studies. And when we stack these locations side by side, you see how wildly the challenges vary. For example, look at Botswana's Chobe Enclave. Down there, conservationists are forced to balance the economic promise of ecotourism directly against the very real local reliance on bushmeat. If those ecotourism dollars don't actually make it into the pockets of the villagers, well, those locals logically just turn back to hunting so they can feed their families. It's a direct life-or-death trade-off. Then jump all the way over to the Brazilian Cerrado. Here, tourism is just caught in the crossfire of intense socio-political conflict. Locals aren't just trying to build hiking trails. They are actively fighting for their land rights against massive corporate agriculture and huge mining operations that want to clear-cut the whole region. And even right here in North America, tensions are through the roof. The focus is on massive ecological restoration projects and the really intense debates around rewilding. You've got ranchers, government agencies, and indigenous groups all clashing over what land use should actually look like. So yeah, context is absolutely everything.
But hey, there are definitely bright spots that show us what a win actually looks like. Take the Maasai Mara in Kenya, for instance. This case study proves that when pastoralist communities are genuinely integrated into the tourism economy, and we're talking equitable land leasing, running guided safaris, or managing local craft co-ops, their overall community resilience just skyrockets. And here's the really cool part. When their financial resilience goes up through those direct, tangible benefits, their support for conservation dramatically increases right alongside it. Simply put, when the community wins, the land wins.
All right, Section 4, who holds the power? Because, let's be real, we have to ask, why do some of these initiatives succeed brilliantly, like we saw in Kenya, while others just fail spectacularly? The review highlights a very real, very insidious danger that academics call neoliberal conservation. Let's look at the Green Life Project in Sumatra as an example. Now, on paper, this sounds like an amazing ecotourism initiative. But when you look at the reality on the ground, the governance structure actually acts as a mechanism to reinforce outside external control. Instead of empowering the people who actually live there, outside corporations swoop in, they build all the infrastructure, and then they funnel out all the profits. The locals are left with basically nothing except restricted access to their own ancestral forests. It's literally just transferring power straight into the hands of external market forces. And we can see this power dynamic play out so clearly when we contrast two totally different governance models. Consider the privately protected areas down in Chile. Yes, they are highly market-driven, and sure, they're very efficient at conservation, but they reshape land ownership in ways that raise massive red flags when it comes to equity, access, and basic social justice for the locals, who usually end up priced out or fenced out of their own backyards. Now, compare that to an indigenous community approach in Mexico. Their model is completely community-centered. It's deeply rooted in traditional cultural values and shared stewardship. And it proves that collective ownership and participatory decision-making aren't just a nice idea. They offer a highly viable and, frankly, a much healthier alternative to those purely market-driven setups. And what exactly happens when you just ignore these underlying power dynamics? Well, the harsh reality, as we see in the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh, is that if you're dealing with entrenched power imbalances and incredibly weak social capital, even the most beautifully written, perfectly well-intentioned co-management strategy is going to fail. Period. You simply cannot slap a community-managed sticker on a project if the foundational power structure is totally rigged. Section 5. Practical Rules for Impact. So what's the solution here? How do we take all these dire academic warnings and actually translate them into a practical, boots-on-the-ground field guide for modern conservationists? Well, the answer, highlighted in the Nepal case studies, is what researchers call polycentric governance. Now, don't let the dense terminology scare you off. Polycentric governance is just a really fancy way of saying flexible, community-led decision-making. In Nepal, instead of the central government dictating every single rule from some distant capital city, local forest user groups were actually given the authority to negotiate, manage their own resources, and adapt to changes in real time. It means stripping away the rigid top-down bureaucracy and relying way more on how local stakeholders naturally interact and solve problems. So, drawing directly from this research, here is your practical Mike is outside checklist for making a real impact. Number 1, ditch the rigid, formal institutional structures. They almost never survive contact with the real world. Number 2, confront power dynamics head-on. If an outside corporation is holding all the cards, you've got to call it out. Number 3, demand genuine, meaningful community participation. We're not talking about token involvement where locals just get to nod at a town hall meeting. Number 4, prioritize flexibility, because as we've seen, context is absolutely everything. And finally, ensure your governance model can actually adapt to evolving social and environmental conditions. Guys, this isn't just abstract theory, this is the literal playbook for protecting the wild spaces we all care about.
And that brings us to Section 6, the final verdict.
So, what's the final verdict on the actual source material? The reviewers are pretty clear on this. First off, there is a serious warning for the casual student. Just between us, the language in this book is incredibly dense, and the theory is complex enough that it makes for a really tough, fragmented read if you don't have an instructor to guide you through the weeds. But on the flip side, it is an absolute goldmine of real-world insights for conservation practitioners, policymakers, and tourism professionals. If you are actually working out in the field and you need concrete, tested examples of how community capital and governance interact, this text is exactly what you've been looking for. If you take absolutely nothing else away from this explainer today, please let it be this one thought. The biggest, most crucial takeaway is that success in protecting the outdoors is almost never about the paperwork. Effective governance is shaped almost entirely by the underlying dynamics of power, real inclusivity, and genuine local participation. So, as you head out into the wild this weekend, I want to leave you with a question to really chew on. How can you, as an outdoor enthusiast, actually advocate for better, more inclusive governance the next time you visit a protected area? Knowing what you know now about who really holds the power behind the scenes, how will that change the way you recreate? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the science of the outdoors. Stay curious, stay focused, and I will see you in the next explainer.